Let's speak with Tom Brake, Lib Dem Brexit spokesperson. Afternoon to you, Tom Brake.
Good afternoon.
You'll be glad to know we're not talking about the Archbishop of Canterbury, although it is worth mentioning that I'm assuming you would happily attend one of his town hall meetings.
Absolutely.
So within the last hour, opposition leaders meeting to discuss how they could work together to stop a no-deal Brexit passing legislation. Your party were involved in this. What can you tell us as to what happened?
Well, it was a very positive meeting. There was a clear agreement from all parties represented that we're going to work together to stop no deal, and we're going to do that through a legislative route. And I think what gave us a real boost in terms of agreeing to work on this is the plans that Boris Johnson has, apparently, to shut the people and Parliament out of choosing whether they want to crash out with no deal. If Boris Johnson is proposing closing down Parliament, then we have to work together to ensure he's not allowed to do that.
Of course, he would argue he is the Democrat here because he's simply carrying out the letter of that referendum. I know these are arguments we've all been over 1,000 times, but ultimately, if we were sitting there in a court of law, he'd win, wouldn't he? He's carrying out the will of the people. You're the one usurping it, or trying to.
Well, first of all, this might end up in a court of law, and I'm not convinced that he would win it. But secondly, there is absolutely no case whatsoever that he can make that 3 years ago in the EU referendum, people voted to leave without a deal. He, Michael Gove, and all the senior leading Brexiters are all on record saying what a brilliant deal with all the advantages of being in the EU we were going to get without any of the responsibilities.
Well, we can get that after the 31st, of course, because you can only really start striking up your deals after we've left.
Well,
you know that. You're the Brexit spokesperson for the Lib Dems. You must know that, Tom Brake.
Well, what I know is that if we leave without a deal on the 31st of October, we're not going to be discussing a new trade relationship with the EU. We're going to be discussing exactly the same three things that we have been discussing all along, because the EU have made that clear. That includes EU citizens' rights, that includes the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, and that includes the settlement bill. That is what we'll be discussing.
Well, that's part of it, but clearly at some point we're going to have to talk about deals with Spain and Portugal, Italy, Germany, etc.
Well, the EU have said all along that those issues had to be resolved before we get into those discussions. And, of course, by leaving without a deal, we then have no leverage at all in those negotiations. I think we will be even more vulnerable as a result of that.
Why would we be more vulnerable? Some would say we've got supreme autonomy at that point. We're calling the shots here.
Well, at the moment, we are still party to some of these discussions. We still have a degree of influence. We still have people present in these meetings. If we leave without a deal at all on the 1st of November, then we are completely excluded, and all of those discussions will take place solely amongst the 27. And I suspect that the feeling towards the UK having left without a deal, particularly if Boris Johnson maintains this threat, which I think, again, probably wouldn't stand up in court, that he doesn't think there is any payment the UK needs to make to the EU, given the financial commitments we have already made, then I think that's hardly the basis for conducting a warm and friendly relationship or getting a good deal.
A lot of people, Tom Brake, will be scratching their head saying, hang on a second, Theresa May got a deal. There was no crashing out. It might not have been perfect in all respects. You could have voted for it. You voted against it on political lines because at that point it wasn't a case of deal or no deal. You just wanted to remain within the EU. So your argument has changed now, hasn't it? Because you could have voted for Theresa May's deal.
Well, indeed, and so could Boris Johnson on a number of occasions.
Well, he did on one occasion.
Well, I mean, he didn't on others, as did not a number of Conservative members of Parliament. The fact is,
but you have made it quite clear that if we are going to leave, you want some kind of deal, and Theresa May got that deal, and because of the way tribal politics works, you couldn't possibly support it, Tom, could you? And I'm sure you went home at night, laid your head on the pillow, and thought, it's not a bad deal actually, but I can't be seen publicly to endorse this one.
No, I thought it was a hopeless deal. What it did not do, of course, is provide any clarity whatsoever on what our future relationship with the EU is going to be. Again, that is something, of course, that leading Brexiters like David Davis, for instance, assured us is something that we would have clarity on before we actually left the European Union. Again, I'm afraid a promise that he and others have not been able to deliver.
So where does this go now? Yourself, your party, SNP, the Greens, the likes of Anna Soubry from Change and others get together with the leader of the opposition. Some people would have thought this unthinkable a year ago. You're all in cahoots and you're trying to stop a no deal. How do you tangibly now do that? What's the next step?
Well, the clear agreement at the meeting was that we would proceed on the basis of a legislative initiative. We know that that has been successful in the past, where Parliament required the then Prime Minister, Theresa May, to secure an extension, which was then granted. So we know that can be done. That is the approach that we are going to focus on. And as I said, we've been given added impetus because the Prime Minister thinks that his way of proceeding when a majority of MPs don't support the stance he's going to take is simply to shut down Parliament.
So you're as I understand it from that meeting, the concentration will be on the legislative possibilities as distinct from simply going in a no confidence vote.
Yes, that is our absolute priority, something that we are going to be working on actively. A number of sort of subgroups are being set up to take that work forward because we know that we've got very little time.
What do you say to a passionate Brexiter, somebody who isn't some mad right-wing bigot, as some areas of our world like to define Brexiters as, who just happens to think that autonomy is the best way forward? It might be a little bumpy for a bit, but we can make it all work. They voted for that. They knew what they were voting for. How would you, as a elected representative, Tom Brake, explain your position now to somebody like that? What did they get wrong?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I have never called any Brexit voter a bigot. I have never done that. I perfectly understand the reasons why many people voted for Brexit, because they felt they'd been left out of some of the success perhaps that they had seen in certain cities, because they felt that they weren't, their standard of living wasn't keeping up with, with other people. I perfectly understand that. The question for me, however, is what autonomy do we get once we are out of the most influential bloc in the world, 500 million people, the wealthiest bloc in the world? What we are already seeing is that in relation to things like the UK-US trade deal, we are not going to have autonomy. If we are going to do a trade deal with the US, President Trump has made it crystal clear what the price of that is going to be. The Americans want to sell us agricultural produce, which is produced to different standards to ours. He will insist on that as part of the trade deal. So when we sit down with him, a smaller country up against the world's richest country with the largest economy and so on, what autonomy do we have in those discussions with him?
But we'll also be sitting down with other countries, Tom, won't we? And over the time, we can rework and refine those relationships. There could be a point 2 years down the line and say, OK, we agreed to this, but now actually this is something we'd like to alter. I mean, that's an ongoing negotiation. It's not cast in stone, is it?
Well, that is true. That's one advantage that we have if we leave the European Union. We have the ability, perhaps more flexibly, to make those changes. The only problem is that I think we will always be at a disadvantage because a larger, wealthier bloc has more leverage. When the European Union sits down and negotiates with the US, it has more clout. When it sits down and negotiates with China or India, it has more clout. When we sit down with China or India, we know, because they have already stated as much, that India, for instance, what they will require in a trade deal with the UK is more access to UK jobs market for Indian citizens. They have already stated that. So our autonomy, I would suggest, is rather fictitious.
All right. On that point, Tom Brake, Lib Dem spokesperson on all matters Brexit. Thank you. With us here on Talk Radio. Yeah, you heard what the man said. And I put that to him at the beginning, this isn't about, let's be honest, and I've said this consistently, for the likes of Tom Brake and Dominic Grieve, I said it a moment ago, this is really about stopping Brexit, isn't it? It's now being kind of masked in a, well, no, it's all about the no deal thing. That's a change. This is really, these guys want to stop Brexit, and they're allowed to want to stop Brexit. It's not North Korea. They can have that view if they want to. But which bit of the 2016 referendum is Tom Brake not digesting? I guess he will be in the camp of, well, people didn't vote for a car crash Brexit. I think that's probably, well, as you heard from him there, what his position is.
Parliament not back until next week, but there was a meeting led by Jeremy Corbyn this morning of cross-party leaders. So the Lib Dem leader Joe Swinson was at that, Anna Soubry of the Independent Group, the Greens, Caroline Lucas was there, Ian Blackford, who's the Westminster leader of the SNPs, and they were all talking about how they can block a no-deal Brexit as things stand. We will leave the EU on October the 31st, and the Prime Minister Boris Johnson has made no secret of the fact that he will do that, whether or not there is a deal in place. We can speak now to Tony Lloyd, Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary, Labour MP for Rochdale. Evening to you. Thank you for making time to speak to Talk Radio Drive, Tony. Tell us, first of all, on the Jeremy Corbyn meeting. We heard Keir Starmer speaking this morning about a legal course to use Parliament to block no deal. Can you explain what that course is, please?
I can, but let me just make this point. In a way, this issue isn't about the parliamentary devices. It's about making sure that we do block the disaster of a no-deal Brexit, which would do things like lead into shortage of medicine, food shortages, open the way for a trade deal with Trump's America, with all the potential damage to our National Health Service. So the issue we're fighting for isn't an ideological one, except that with this red line, it's how do we stop that no-deal Brexit. But directly in response to your question, obviously what we need to do when Parliament gets back, and the Speaker is going to be very important in this, what the Speaker will allow, and I certainly don't speak for him, we've got to try to use every parliamentary device to find what way we can move things forward. Now, one of the ways may well be to take control, as we did some months back, of the order paper. Very unusual, but in a constitutional crisis like this, important to make sure that we can bring forward legislation that blocks that no-deal Brexit on October the 31st to make sure that Boris Johnson can't crash it out.
And what is that legislation?
Well, the legislation would need to do a number of things. It would need to insist that Britain approach the European Union again for a further extension to make sure there was proper time for reconsideration. It would then be up to Parliament to use that time to make sure that we move things on. Now, the way of moving things on clearly is to go back in one form or another, whether it's by way of referendum or by way of general election, to the people of this country, because in the end, this particular construct of the narrow divide between the Conservative Party and the opposition parties hasn't been able to deliver anything over the last 3 years. We've got to change that. The only people who can change it are people like you, people like your listeners. How
do you propose, though, to get that legislation through the Commons and the Lords when it's the government that normally sets that? Are you relying on one of these standing order procedures?
It is the government who normally sets the agenda, that's absolutely right. But I think, in fairness, and I repeat, the Speaker will have to make his own judgment on these things. But what he made clear is he will do what he can to prevent a no-deal crash-out Brexit. That's very helpful, because what it does mean is that unusually, and you're right to point out, governments normally do control the order paper. This government has hardly used parliamentary time for legislation, so it is about time we saw the use of Parliament as the legislative chamber.
So what we're talking about is potentially a Labour proposal of a standing order procedure, and then what you rely on is Speaker John Bercow allowing a binding vote to follow that. And we should point out to listeners that normally standing order procedures do not have a binding vote after them.
Indeed, and that's absolutely the case. It's lots of people will be probably not that bothered about how the thing is done through Parliament, but you're spot on in the way you've described it. We've got to have a vote that binds the government. We've had votes in the past where we've made it clear that Parliament and the huge majority in Parliament is against a no-deal Brexit because of the recognition of the real damage that would do. Damage just in passing that the leaked Yellowhammer document last week made very clear. Even that's the government's own assessment of how damaging things would be. But we've got to use the parliamentary process in a way that moves us all on, and specifically make sure that the government can't wriggle out of that by saying it doesn't bind government.
And in your view, is this parliamentary process, Tony Lloyd, is that more effective than a no-confidence motion, which seems to be splitting politicians across parties?
Well, what will be effective, central to your point, is just that, is what brings politicians together, because this isn't about parties. It can no longer be about personalities. It's not about Jeremy Corbyn or another. It's about actually making sure, and that's why Jeremy Corbyn brought all parties together, making sure we can build a majority across the House. And let me be clear on that. That will need some Conservative MPs voting for country above party, and all other parties have got to do the same. We know there's a majority there in the Commons. 116 Conservative and Independent MPs voted against a no-deal Brexit just a couple of months back. So we know that majority is there. We've got to find the device that brings people together. I mean, look, let me say casually, I don't care how we stop a no-deal Brexit as long as we stop that no-deal Brexit, because my constituents and the people that I represented with my role in Northern Ireland, who would be so damaged with the capacity to see a return to a hard border in Northern Ireland, the potential that gives to those who prefer violence to politics to return to that bounds. I will do everything I can do to stop that, because it's so important for the future of the country. You know, frankly, if we're going to bring people together again, it won't be by having a trade deal with Trump. It will be actually continuing with some proper trade deal with our European Union partners, our biggest single trading bloc partner. It's how we now begin to move forward in a way that stops the no deal process and moves us on to something that's a lot more rational and a lot more acceptable.
Well, as we're going beyond party politics and looking at the bigger picture then, have you in the Labour Party got any suggestions to make as to an alternative for the Northern Ireland backstop? Because the EU were asking Mr Johnson that at the weekend, and he didn't seem to offer them anything. Have you got a suggestion that would keep the EU happy, but that would not put the Good Friday Agreement into jeopardy?
Well, I mean, look, the Good Friday Agreement is it's not a sacred text. I don't want to give it that status, but it is something that is pretty important. It brought an end to the violence that older listeners remember, and an end to the violence that, fortunately, your younger listeners don't remember. It changed the way Northern Ireland related to itself, how people related. It's not perfect there. They've not got perfect politics. But we can't sacrifice the Good Friday Agreement. Actually, the best way, ultimately, of that is to go back to the British people, including the people of Northern Ireland, with the view to saying to them, look, we've now got to look at what our future is. And I think one of the things that almost certainly in any referendum, if we reach that point, there will be an option to remain within the European Union. That will very clearly give people the option in Northern Ireland, the option in Great Britain.
But we're a long way from that, aren't we? Because at the moment, what they're trying to do, if we believe these people that are involved, is they're trying to work out the backstop problem to get to a deal, to prevent no deal.
Yeah, but, you know, there is no flip solution to avoiding something like the backstop. I mean, you can all the talk of technological solutions, most people have dismissed as being totally unrealistic, and certainly in anything other than the very long run. And we haven't got a long run to play around. So to avoid a hard border, we've got to make sure we continue with a trading relationship, which is what Labour has campaigned for consistently over time. Yeah, it could be to stay within the European Union, but it could have been the kind of soft Brexit we talked about in the past, where we had alignment of customs and single market standards that would have prevented that hard border. But without something like that, quite frankly, you're not going to be able to convince the European Union that they can do away with the backstop.
So when Parliament reconvenes next week, is your priority to try and trigger one of these standing order notices first, or is your priority as a party to trigger a no confidence motion? Which order do you play it?
I think the conversation that came out today across all the opposition parties was that it's more likely it will be that legislative route. But what will be happening between now and next Tuesday when Parliament returns, I can guarantee there'll be all manner of telephone calls, WhatsApp messages, emails, you name it, making sure that we can and do build a majority that it will be effective. And repeating what I said before, the only bottom line in this, the only red line, the fashionable phrase, is to stop that no-deal Brexit. So the actual mechanic is going to come out from what can get that majority to get the Parliament over the line for something that says we have now stopped a no-deal Brexit.
Let me ask you to clarify something, if you're able to, about the meeting this morning, because all over the weekend newspapers was the suggestion that part of the reason why the no confidence motion may not work for you is that Jeremy Corbyn has insisted he becomes interim leader if you win that motion. First of all, has he mandated that? Is that a fair claim that's been made?
I don't think it is fair. I mean, look at what's happened today. Jeremy Corbyn brought together the leaders of all the opposition parties for talks that ranged across the piece. Would have looked at every different issue. But
he's not insisting that in the event of a win on a no-confidence motion that he becomes default leader.
Well, it's not a question of personalities around this. It's a question of agreeing a common process. And a common process, if we went down that route, would be looking for literally a caretaker prime minister who could take the country forward in two ways. One, to get into negotiation with Brussels to say we now need to extend Article 50 in order for a general election, in order possibly for a referendum, whichever Parliament can agree to, and move the country on in that basis. If there are other ways of achieving the same thing, then Labour and Jeremy Corbyn is not going to stand in that way.
So who is the caretaker person in that situation then?
Well, I don't think it's a question of looking for personalities. I repeat.
Well, the reason why, I'm sure you know, the reason I'm dwelling on it, Tony, is because people like Jo Swinson are saying that Jeremy Corbyn's a barrier to that no-confidence motion going through, because if he is the default leader, people won't vote for it.
I've heard and seen as you described. But let me just make the obvious point that, for example, the SNP, the Green Party, Plaid Cymru, have made it clear they would work with Jeremy Corbyn. It would be really perverse to find a situation where one of the smaller opposition parties, and I'm not dismissing the Lib Dems, they're an important part of our parliamentary scene, but one of the smaller parties was to say they are so hung up on personalities that they will block what every other opposition party is prepared to vote for. Look, in the end, it comes back to something I've already said. How do we build that majority in Parliament and make sure that when the whips stand up and announce the result, there are more people voting for something that binds this country not to crash out on October the 31st than otherwise. And that is the only red line for Jeremy Corbyn. It's the only red line for Labour.
But for the Labour Party, if I've understood you correctly, you're saying that you think, as we speak now, and things can change, that your greatest chance of success in blocking no deal is legislative rather than through the no confidence motion. Have I understood you correctly?
Yeah, I think that it's quite likely that is the case from what I understand of the meeting this morning. I wasn't actually at that, so I can't tell you of every word that was spoken. But again, I think what all of the opposition parties came out of that room saying is that they will work together to find the way of stopping no deal. Now, in the end, this can't be about people having their own individual fixations. It really is. Put country ahead of party, and we've got to do it as a party. Other parties have got to do it. Some Conservative MPs will have to do it. The country deserves better than this deadlock, and we've got to move it all on.
Thank you very much for making time to speak to me. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Tony Lloyd, Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary, Labour MP for Rochdale, on the meeting that his party leader led and called this morning, which brought together leaders from across the political spectrum, except the Conservative Party, to look at efforts to block through Parliament and through legislation a no-deal Brexit. Incidentally, I should tell you that there was a separate meeting this afternoon of 160 backbench MPs who've signed a declaration saying they will use whatever mechanism possible to block a no-deal Brexit. It's going to be a very busy week next week.